This is gonna take crackerjack timing, Wang.
Total concentration. You ready, Jack?
I was born ready.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and it's time for your September 2020 comic book sales analysis. And I'm going to be honest, it's kind of hard to actually gauge what's going on in the marketplace. There is reporting via ICV2.com, which has one mechanism that's kind of using sales to customers through Comic Hub. There's also reporting through Comichron.com, which is using information from Diamond, which no longer distributes DC Comics. So it's making everything a little bit more complicated probably than it needs to be. But El Percherino has joined me, and we're going to try to make some sense of the madness. And we're also going to cover a rumor that concerning the amount of sales for DC Comics that UCS was responsible for in respect to Lunar. We're going to cover that at the end. But we're going to talk sales first, specifically comic book sales in September. How you doing, Perch?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. And yeah, you're right. It has become very difficult to tell what's going on.
Yes. So before we get into the details, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this segment. Give me a thumbs down if you don't. Either way, we definitely want to know what your thoughts are on the September 2020 comic book sales. What do you think? Are sales up right now? Are they down? We're going to try and give you the best picture that we can. But here's just to kind of demonstrate how difficult this is. So there on the left is February 2020's comic sales, and you can see there's actually sales numbers. Wolverine distributed 190,000 comics, number one. X-Men 6 and 7 were like 92,000, 77,000. Batman 88, 89. Obviously they were just under 75,000. That was the top five. So over on the right, this is the September 2020 sales via Comichron. These are obviously through Diamond, but we do not have actual sales numbers, but we can try and gauge where things are, but it gets kind of confusing. So here down at the bottom, we only find them when they're dead is the number 13 seller. And according to Bleeding Cool, that comic distributed 75,000 issues, which would be amazing because in February, that would have been the number 4 selling comic. Department of Truth, according to Bleeding Cool and SciFiWire.com, shipped over 100,000, which would have made it the number 2 selling comic in February 2020. Also, we were told, I believe it was Spawn 310, which shipped in September, was the number 15 book, also shipped over 100,000. It is not even in here. So where does the disparity come in here? I do not think that sales have gone up so much that the number 2 book or the number 8 book in September, not including DC Comics, would be the number 2 book in February.
Yeah, it's unlikely. I think a couple things. The numbers have been reported by Bleeding Cool, and the things that have come out are fairly anecdotal. They may or may not be rounded up. Other people have said that we also don't know how they're getting to that number. We don't know if that's a initial number and then an estimated second printing that they're kind of rolling into one. They have done that in the past. So it's hard to know if this is actually the number or not. You could generally assume that this is higher than it actually turned out for the first printing of the number 1 issue. Maybe not by a ton, but you can assume that. The other thing, though, that's happened, and I think we talked about it before, is that comic shops are reporting that their higher end comics, meaning like the top 10, 20 comics that they sell, are selling more, that sales have increased for the top. And what's decreased is the middle and the bottom. Those have sunk further. So there has been this push up into, the top 15 or so comics are starting to break 75K, which really wasn't the case back in February. But the overall business hasn't improved because the middle has decreased. And I think there's some truth to that if you just look at some of these titles, because there's some interesting ones that stand out, like Fantastic Four is on there, which it looks like an anomaly. That means that title is selling in the probably about 90K by estimates, if these numbers are to be believed. Now, there was an incentive program, I believe, on this title, which is boosting it up like we got with Immortal Hulk last year quite a bit. But all in all, I think we are seeing some rise at the top, and we're seeing an erosion in the middle and the bottom, leading to an overall flat, or maybe even for U.S. comics, slightly decreasing picture. I don't say it to be negative. That seems to be how it's working out.
So I thought maybe that when when Image Comics, whoever the sources for the Department of Truth 100,000, maybe they were including like the special comic store like exclusive variant covers.
Yeah.
Maybe that isn't calculated directly into Diamond sales. Could that be it?
I'm sure it's rolling in more numbers than actually sold through Diamond. I mean, but then they could come from a bunch of places. They could come from custom covers, like you mentioned. I do think with we only find them when they're dead. There is some counting of estimated second print into that number. I do know that, but don't know how much. So these numbers are rolled up to more than, it's not apples to apples anymore. Between February and September, your picture here is great, and the fact that we've lost that column there on the far right, it makes it all a guessing game. Yes,
that's kind of the point here. So it's pretty difficult to look at it, but we'll kind of compare the sources what we have here in the middle in the gray and white column with the orange banner. That is from ICV2.com, and that is basically what Comic Hub is saying. Their 80 stores sold to customers in their ranking list. On the left, we have Comic-Con's listing of Marvel comics and then what that was ordered the most. And on the right, we have DC's. Those are on the top 10. And it looks to me, at the top end, DC is absolutely annihilating Marvel with Batman 3 Jokers, Joker War, also Dark Knight's Death Metal is in there. Marvel's not doing too bad. Obviously, Ten of Swords is doing very well. Venom, the Wrath of Venom series, as we lead up to King in Black. Do you find this to be an accurate picture here in the middle? Like we'll see Batman 3 Jokers #1 is #5, and you won't see that in either column because apparently that was like sales of that initial 300,000 that were shipped.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the column in the middle. So I think what is true about this, and you have to kind of start to dissect it a little bit, is that this is probably indicative of the order of what was sold. Meaning, Ten of Swords creation sold more than Venom, which sold more than Department of Truth, which sold more than Fantastic Four. I think the order and the ranking is pretty accurate. And then I think when you get to DC, this ranking is probably fairly accurate, but unlike with Marvel and Image, you don't have reliable Diamond ranking. You are getting, basically it's like polling. They're going to a number of stores, they're getting some numbers, they're aggregating stuff out, but it's probably close, but probably not perfect. Like, for example, if we looked at this picture, you might say, Detective Comics actually didn't outsell Batman. I mean, who knows? So I think there's probably a little bit of movement there, but it's probably fairly accurate. But when you combine them together in this picture, here's where I think it becomes really dodgy pretty fast. I do think 3 Jokers #2 was probably the top selling book. And I do think that Batman 98 was probably the second top selling book. I think that there's at least some anecdotal evidence to prove that. I think when you get down below that, it probably is a little bit more mixed than this because, yeah, if this was the picture, DC Comics would be doing amazing. They have some $6.99, $9.99, $9.99 books. Dollar share, they'd probably be getting close to Marvel at this point, even though they shipped a lot fewer books. And so I don't think this picture is quite correct. But I think for all your viewers who sometimes say, why is DC focusing on Batman? Why do we just get so many Batman comics cranking out? Well,
they're the top 5.
Yeah, this is why. I mean, sales tell the story. So, I think that there's stuff to learn here. The challenge is we're never going to get back to one list, or at least we're not going to get back to it until, either the comic publishers cooperate, which they won't, or, everybody goes back to Diamond, or there's a new Diamond that everybody works through. We're not going to get one list again. So we're going to be in this guessing game. Unfortunately, like polling can be wrong.
Yeah. Fairly, confusing. Like you look over here on sales from Diamond, Web of Venom Wraith is #3, but then when you look over here in the middle chart is the Comic Hub list, it ends up being number 19 overall, and it's like the number 11 Marvel comic. Like there's a big disparity.
Right, and we don't know if they're necessarily counting dollars or units there to put together, or unfortunately,
this is units. That one's units. We're going to look at dollars next.
Okay, well, never mind then. I guess we do. So then I don't have an answer to that. Unfortunately, the people pulling this stuff together is doing a very bizarre amalgamation of a bunch of different data points. It's strange.
Yeah. So getting to the dollar units. We do not have a dollars list for Marvel, but Comic-Con did have one for DC. And it's interesting. So you look at here, the top 5 comics are DC, and the next one is number 10 by units. But if we look at dollars, of the top 8, 7 of them are DC, and you look at it, $5.99, $5.99. The Batman comics are both $3.99, $6.99, $6.99, $9.99. Like all the high end stuff, obviously, is bumping up the DC numbers. We got another Dark Knight's Death Metal, $5.99 jumps in the top 20. Strange Adventures, another $4.99 comic book.
Yeah.
Obviously, DC's bread and butter right now really is their higher price comic. So something that we noticed, and this was courtesy of you that I talked about in our January solicitations. In January, DC, if you look at the average per issue cost, it's approaching $5 for DC, whereas Marvel is still below at $4.25. And you can see why they're focusing in on these high-priced 80th anniversary anthology comics, these really expensive anthologies with events and things like this, because they're obviously moving units because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so this strategy, and I think DC probably won't walk away from this. They're making more money. Their average per issue cost has increased. Like the picture you showed before there, I mean, Detective Comics being a $9.99 book as an anniversary issue, yeah, that's going to move a ton of units for them, and it's going to allow them to dominate in the dollar charts. And so I think that DC's not crazy. I think they're highly likely to keep this up as they move past Future State and everything else. You're going to have some of their signature books be up in that category. They're not going to rely completely on anniversary issues. It works for them. So they are pushing that number up, which is interesting because, like we talked about too, it's they had the reputation for being the cheaper company, that they were holding the line at $2.99 and everything else. And we are living in a world where Marvel, largely because of mass, is going to probably wind up on average per issue cheaper, which is weird to think about. But it is, again, it's hard to see this picture. I mean, I think you could probably pull away that DC is fairly close to Marvel in dollar share. However, Marvel's just putting out so many more books, and that's going to bump up their overall take for sure. I mean, just because they have a lot more out, and particularly with collections, which isn't part of this picture, they've got a lot more out. So it's, it's a strategy for them. It's working. So I think we're going to see them continue it.
Yeah, it's crazy. Marvel's already has an Empire omnibus.
Yeah.
they're promoting. Everything is an omnibus nowadays. So it's interesting. I do think this $4.96 is a bit of an anomaly because a larger portion of what DC is selling in January is going to be DC Black Label. Plus, there are some premium price books within Future State. I think once the line gets kind of more back to normal, this probably goes down closer to $4.50. But I don't know, how long before you think the average DC Comics actually eclipses $5? Are we looking at that within the next 2 or 3 years?
If they hold their, I think we are. I think if they hold their sale fairly well through Future State, if they realize that, this idea of the slightly bigger book with a main story and then kind of a backup story, which is reasonably cheap to produce, if the customers will buy that happily and pay $4.99 for it, they're not going to come away from that. They're going to go into their main line continuing that. So I do think that DC will hit $4.99. I think Marvel will as well. I mean, the thing about Marvel is if they see DC being successful, they'll instantly snap to that model too, probably without the backup story. But I do think that DC's testing the waters there, and it will depend. If sales kind of fall off the cliff January and February for DC, then I think you'll see them come back. But
very interesting stuff. So let's talk about this Lunar UCS business. We talk about UCS is no longer going to be distributing DC Comics starting in January. It's going to be all for DC Comics. And there's this headline on Bleeding Cool, UCS selling 2, 3, 4 times more DC Comics than Lunar. And when I saw this, I was like, that doesn't really make sense. Just looking at the map, yeah, you could say, you got Texas, Florida, you got the East Coast here with New York and a lot of the higher populations. But if you look at what Lunar was covering before, you got California, Washington, Oregon. You still have Chicago, Denver, a lot of highly populated areas in there too. And like I just couldn't believe it when I saw this headline. Like, what is their anecdotal evidence? Do you even believe this?
I don't. And I mean, this article got a bunch of comments going in a bunch of retailer channels with the same kind of that doesn't add up, and it doesn't. I think Bleeding Cool has a small subset of shops that they talk to, and most of those shops are on the East Coast. They've got a few scattered on the West, but they're basically getting this data from their sample pool of information. And keep in mind, their pool of information tends to be fairly anti-DC, as you've seen in a lot of their coverage. Absolutely. And so I think this is just kind of a reflection of that. I think there's no logic here. Now, the one bit that is true is that UCS probably was selling more comics than Lunar, but not at this volume, simply because of the regions for Lunar were a little bit more rural and isolated. You don't have as many comic shops in those territories as you do some of the UCS territories. And the other part is the pandemic shut down California, which would have been one of the biggest areas for Lunar. And UCS, by and large, with Texas, with Florida, with Georgia, with a couple of these places, there were a lot of shops there that were open and getting content. So I think that there was a situational thing happening, which probably boosted that number up. But the idea that they were selling 3 to 4 times as much is ludicrous, and generally everybody thought so.
Okay, so I saw that and I was like, Balderdash. That doesn't even make sense.
Yeah,
I'm not the smartest man in the room, but I can look at it like that doesn't look right at all. But I definitely wanted to bring it up with you. I was going to do a video just about that. I was like, I don't even think I can talk about that for 10 minutes because it just sounds so stupid.
It's indicative of their sources and kind of what they do to go get content, and unfortunately you have to take a lot of stuff that site says with a big grain of salt.
Absolutely. So that'll basically kind of cover our September 2020 comic sales analysis. Is the industry up? It looks like at the top end sales are up, but like we said, there is a lot of evidence that in the mid to lower section of comic books, the sales are actually down. Is it even? I imagine it's got to be down a little bit just because of the pandemic. Not everybody's open fully back to where they kind of were. There's still unrest going on.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Feels like there is a rebound. Obviously, Batman 3 Jokers, Joker War, Dark Knight's Death Metal have led the charge for DC Comics. Ten of Swords appears to be a hit. Maybe not quite as big a hit as Marvel was expecting, but all indications are also that King in Black is going to be an enormous hit too.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how Ten of Swords rolls out in those sales numbers. You saw that the first issue did really well. X-Men, which was kind of the issue rolling into it, was doing okay. It's further down the list, but Excalibur was way down the list. So the big question to watch for next month is going to be how these lower titles are. Is Ten of Swords giving them a significant sales boost or not? That's going to be interesting to see.
Absolutely. I cannot wait till we actually get the numbers back because they speak so much more than just a ranking. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And we may never, though. We'll see.
Do you have a theory why Diamond isn't reporting those now? Is it because
I think they don't have to anymore. I think Marvel was probably leaning on them not to. And when they had DC rolled into their group, they kind of had to. It was one of those things. But now they don't need to, so they're not. And I don't know if they're going to bring those back.
Well, we will endure, Perch, and we will bring the best analysis that we can with the information available. Obviously, kind of piecemealing things here and there. Thank you so much for joining me. If you haven't subscribed to Perch's YouTube channel, there's a link in the video description. There's also an icon on the channel right about now or in a few seconds. It says Comics by Perch. You can select that and go and subscribe that way. Anything else you need to say?
No. Just thank you for having me on.
Well, I thank you for visiting. I really appreciate it. We'll definitely be talking again this week.
Absolutely.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter at Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.